recording.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for that awesome introduction. Yes, actually, so my background was being a high school English teacher. And then I fell in love with technology and then realized that I had a passion for it. And so it's actually interesting that my coding background is not in software development, it is in basically practical application. I like to tell people really I'm more into scripting even than I am in programming. And for me, the functional difference is automating tasks. It is trying to reduce errors in tasks. And so that's exactly why I fell in love with web scraping, because I had throughout my career needed to pull data from websites in some type of automated way. And it turns out Python was a great tool to do that. And so I'm going to approach this workshop not as being a beautiful piece of highly optimized code, but rather the primer that it takes to be able to work with Python, to begin automating some basic processes, as well as working with a core set of libraries that are really common if you want to pull data from websites. So I'm really, really excited. Before I get started, I do want to quickly share just a couple of resources. I have put together two documents for you all. I'm going to be throwing those in the chat. These are Google Drive. Oops, sorry, I'm sending those directly to Stephanie. Let's go ahead and try that again. One more time. Okay, so here are some really great documents for you. These two documents are going to be kind of twofold. It's going to be an introduction to Beautiful Soup, which is going to be the library that we're working with, as well as some of the core skills that I'm going to be introducing you to today. But some of the skills that if you're wondering, like, oh, what does that mean? Or I didn't quite understand that technology or that reference, I tried to itemize what I believe to be sort of the essential background information that we need in order to be able to really do this at a next level. You should be able to, with minimal experience, be able to walk through the workshop today. But if you wanted to take this and perform it on a different website, then that's something that, these are sort of the skills that I would recommend. I also wanted to mention as well that this actually comes inspired from a really great section from one of my absolute all-time favorite Python learning resources. And I just posted that in the chat, called Automate the Boring Stuff. This is actually a book called Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. And the author sells this book and it's sold in bookstores, but also published the book through the Creative Commons and posts it on his website. So if you prefer to have a print book, he's making money that way, but the book itself is actually totally for free. And it is often considered one of the best practical introductions to Python, because if you actually look at the book, the first half of the book is, how Python works and how you code Python. But then the other half of the book are projects that automate the boring stuff. And one of the first projects in that book is web scraping. And so I am borrowing the sort of theme or main project from that chapter. And I'm doing that because I want to show you just how great of a resource this is. So I'm going to be walking you through that as well. So that's something that you can come back to in case you want to kind of get another person explaining some of that critical concept. The final thing I wanted to mention is that for today, the coding environment that I'm going to be working in is actually a tool called Replit, and I'll post that website in the chat as well. You can technically follow along using VS Code, the Python IDE, whatever you'd like, but if you're wondering how it's working on my end or what the IDE I'm working with, it is Replit. I like Replit for a couple of reasons. It is super accessible. You can use it on a Chromebook. You don't have to worry about downloading and installing anything. And it is super snappy and has a nice, really modern interface. They've done a couple of things recently that I've maybe not as super thrilled about them, some of their business model, but they do have a free tier. And if you have not made an account here, you can make an account, you can log in, and you can just build your first Python project if you wanted to. So that's going to be about as much of the prerequisite that we need to get started. So my recommendation, click on those links, have them up somewhere, maybe in Chrome, maybe have those later. But in just about 30 seconds or so, I am going to go ahead and start coding. I'm going to be pulling up a code editor. And my hope is that you have maybe just enough background where you have done something in Python before, and you know how an IDE works, you know how to actually run your code. That's about the most minimal amount of prerequisite that we're going to need to get started in terms of like setting up a project. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to go ahead and get my code editor up and ready to go. Awesome. Stephanie, does everything look okay? Are you able to see what looks to be like a code editor?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I want to go ahead and get started by talking about exactly what we're doing. Like, what's the actual mission for today? Well, web scraping is essentially the ability to be able to take data from a website and using code programmatically pull that data out and then in some way extract the exact information that we need. And so one of the cool parts of the project that I mentioned from that Automate the Boring Stuff Python book was going to the website xkcd.com. And if you don't know what this particular website is, it is a really, really fun sort of math and science webcomic that the folks who make these comics are way smarter than me. A lot of them have PhDs, and that there's even a Wikipedia page called Explain XKCD that often has to explain why the joke is funny. But this is just sort of a beloved, sort of very famous webcomic series for hardcore computer science nerd, math nerds, things like that. And so this is the website that we're going to be scraping data from today. And what I essentially want to do is I want to take and scrape every single webcomic from this website and download them locally so that maybe I can look at them at my, offline, for instance. And what you're going to notice that this website's really simple, and I kind of picked a simple website on purpose. But if I click previous here, you're going to notice that the URL is xkcd /3025, which means that there's about 3,000 web comics that have been published as long as this website has been in existence. And I believe they publish every single day, which is really cool. And so obviously, if I wanted to go and download all 3,000 of these images, that would be a nightmare. Obviously, I would have to right click, save image as, and I don't have to do that 3,000 times. That's not really something that I'm on board for doing. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about a way, how can I programmatically visit all 3,000 of these pages, find the image, and download them? And so what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and start with what I think to be the easiest version of this, which is, can I just download the image on the home page? Because a lot of what we want to do in this particular, when we're building web scraping efforts, especially if we're going like page by page by page, is the first major problem is, do I know how to extract the data on the single page? And then do I know how to move forward and then be able to go page by page by page by page? So there's kind of two major problems that we want to solve. So let's start working on problem number one, which essentially is, can I, using just Python, basically download this page and find the URL for this image? And can I download it? So that is problem number one. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and come back over to my Python editor, and I need to import the very first library that's going to help us make these requests, which is going to be import requests. And the request library is a library that is a sort of usually built into Python, but every once in a while you have to install it. If you are on your a system that you are not using Replit, you might have to run pip install requests, and that should allow you to download the request library. Now, once we have requests, this allows me to be able to request or get a web page. So let's go ahead and see what that might look like. If I were to go back to XKCD and I were to, and you don't necessarily have to do this, this is more for demonstration purposes. If I were to inspect the element here and I were to come back over to network, this is a really powerful tool that is often overlooked in the inspect element tool. This allows me to essentially see all of the different HTTP requests that a website makes when it loads the page. So when I click refresh here, you're going to see that I get a handful of requests. Now, some of them are for CSS, for PNGs, for logos, things like that. But the very, very first one here is xkcd.com. This is essentially the request that said, when I clicked refresh, what I'm really saying is go get the xkcd.com assets. And you're going to notice that I made the request to xkcd.com. and that the type of request was a GET request. Now, if you know anything about how HTTP works, which you don't really have to know a whole lot for the sake of this workshop, but it is worth knowing, is that there's a whole bunch of other data that goes with it. But what I'm more interested in is that when I ask for something, I get something back. And in the world of HTTP, we call that a response. So in this case, the response is I said, hey, go get the data at xkcd.com. And in return, I actually got an HTML document. And as you can see here, this is the actual HTML for the actual website that we're looking at. And we can kind of confirm that by just spot checking some things. Like this means you're free to copy and share these comics, but not sell them. So if I scroll down here, it says, this means you're free to copy these and not sell them. So we can see that that data functionally is the same. And so knowing that this is how this works, that when I make a request for a web asset, I get a response back. Let's see if I can sort of simulate that in Python. So now that I've imported the request library, I can create a variable called response because I'm expecting some data back. I'm going to call from the requests library, and I'm going to actually run a GET request. Now, in this particular case, it is going to ask for a URL. Now, I could just pass the URL in as a string, but it's good to sort of like modularize your code a little bit. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the actual URL for this, paste it in right here, and then I'm going to pass in the URL as a variable. This allows me to be able to maybe swap out the URL at a later time without messing with this response. So this functionally says, hey, go get that data, but what is that actually stored as? I got it as a variable, but like, what exactly is it? Well, one of the things I like to do when I'm exploring libraries like this is I just like to print the data just to kind of get a sense for what it possibly could be. And so I'm going to print this response here. And if I were to run this, you're going to notice that I get something a little cryptic, and it says response 200. Now, this is, again, maybe not, you're like, well, I was expecting some HTML. But what's important to know is that a response object is actually just that. It's an object full of tons of data. And we can explore some of that data if we can see some of the headers over here where it says response headers. Notice it actually has a whole bunch of information, like its age, the date that I ended up making the request. And a big one here you can see is that it should also have a status code, which I'm not necessarily seeing right here in the inspect element tool, but it should, if I were to come over here, there we go. In this case, it's a status 304, because I think I refreshed and that's what it was. But that status code is what tells me whether or not it was successfully got to that data. So with all that being said, what we have here is a complex object full of data. And what I want to do is maybe extract some interesting pieces of that response. So notice I can do, for instance, its status code. And if I were to run this again, you're going to notice that I got a 200 status code. And again, if I were to go look up the big table of what all those codes mean, 200 is the universal, everything is okay, here's your data. But I want to actually see the HTML. And so within the response object, we actually have the content. And the content is the actual body of the request, and oftentimes is the actual payload that we were requesting. So in this case, it's going to be the HTML. And if I were to run this, you can just see it gets dumped right into my output, and I can see there's a whole bunch of HTML there. And if I see here again, you're free to copy these, but not sell them. So again, we're seeing that that's the HTML that we care about. And believe it or not, this is all we really need from the request library. Well, I guess we're going to also download in just a moment, but this is really the bulk of what we need the request library for, is just to get the content. Now, technically, we don't need any other libraries to do web scraping. We could somehow use Python to filter out all of this information. I could use regex and regular expressions, but that's miserable. Right now, all I have is a giant text string that contains all of this HTML, and that is pretty much impossible to traverse in any meaningful way. And so the next step that I need to do is I need to convert this HTML, or another word for it is parse it, into some type of format that I'm able to traverse, ask questions, and extract data more programmatically. And so if you can imagine, this process is request the web page. The next step that I need to do is I need to in some way parse the page to make it easy to use. And for this, we are going to be using something called Beautiful Soup. Beautiful Soup is a very, very mature, very stable Python library that is purpose built to allow you to traverse HTML data and extract information out of it. And as a result, it tends to be the de facto standard for web scraping. And so in order to use it, we need to import what's called BS4, or Beautiful Soup 4. Now, just like with requests, you are likely going to need to install this. And unlike requests, this does not come typically installed in Python. So what you are going to need to do is potentially open up, if you're on your own computer, you're going to need to open up a terminal, and you're going to need to physically type. In my case, you could sometimes just type pip install, for instance, BS4. However, I have noticed that in some installations of Python, you have to do py or Python, whatever your keyword is, -m pip install BS4. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. And I actually link in one of those Google Drive links. I actually have a little bit of a tutorial of how to do that. It's really quick. The good news about using Replit, and why I actually recommended using Replit, is that they actually do all of that for you. The moment that it notes that you're using a library, it goes out and it downloads it. So one of the benefits of using this platform is it sort of handles some of your package management for you, which is a big boon, I think, for this, especially for a rapid workshop like this to just get up and going. And so what I've done here is, now that I've installed BS4, or imported it, I should say, I can now parse it. And so, or parse this document. So in the official documentation, what you want to do is create a soup object. And I'm not making it up. It's literally called a soup object. And this soup object is going to be the parsed, structured version of the HTML that you want to be able to ask questions out. And so from here, we have to call from the BS4 library the function called Beautiful Soup. And then Beautiful Soup takes two arguments. It takes the actual HTML you want to parse, which in this case, if you go to the response dot content, that's actually the HTML that we want to parse. And then we have to say, what type of parser do I want to use? And that's going to be the HTML parser. And I'm just going to go ahead and give myself a little room here. Okay, so essentially now what this has done is this has created an object called soup that is behind the scenes a tree. It takes all the HTML and breaks it up into a tree that we can easily pull information from. Now, a nice kind of quick check is you're going to notice that this is the big blob that I got just from the request library. But if I were to print the soup object now, you're going to notice that it's still going to be HTML, but a nice hallmark is that it has been roughly structured so that every node is on its own line, which is one indication that something has happened, that the soup object has actually changed it in some capacity. So at this point, this is the process that we often like to call this is request and soupify. So all of this is sort of part one, request and soupify. Nice. So we've requested the HTML from the page using the request library, and then I have parsed it and converted it into a soup object. Awesome. Now, for part two, what we want to do is, now that we actually have the actual information there, now I can actually start asking questions like, for instance, what's the URL of this particular webcomic? Because remember, the whole goal here is that I want to download this page and then take this image and extract it. And so the easiest way for me to extract it is to get the URL, because if I copy this image address, I can come over here and I can actually narrow it to just that image itself. So my goal is to try and yank out this particular URL from this page here. So let's see if I can do that. So part 2 is going to be find the URL of the image. Cool. So now that I have this soup object, it's actually pretty easy for me to find elements. And this is the beautiful part of Beautiful Soup. So what I can do is if I were to look at the source code for this, and I was able to do that by doing Control U, or you can right click, view page source. And what I want to do is I want to see if I can find where my image lives. And because this is a small website, I can just look at the source code. You can also do Control H. I can look for image. And I'm looking for the actual image itself. And it looks like this is it. I can confirm it by opening this up in a new tab. And lo and behold, there is our comic. So essentially what I want to do is I want to ask the question, can I find that image? Now, Beautiful Soup has a couple of ways to do this. And one of the ways I think I see in a lot of tutorials is I think the hard way. There is a more programmatic way to find this. However, if you know CSS selector syntax, not even all of CSS, just how CSS targets HTML, there is what I believe to be a cheat code. And that is using the select method within Beautiful Soup. And I'm going to show you that. So essentially what you can see here is that my image lives here and it doesn't have any type of ID. It doesn't really have any type of class. Instead, what I can look up above, I can see that this lives inside of a div, and I'm going to zoom in a little for y'all. This lives inside of a div with a unique ID, and that's helpful, called comic. So I know that if I were to find this ID, the image inside of it is the image I want. And because IDs are unique on a page, that means if I find this div, I find this image really reliably. And so if I come back over to here, I can say, hey, I want to find the whole image element. So I'm going to element. There we go. So I'm going to save this as a variable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and invoke my soup object. Remember, the soup is all of my HTML. And I'm going to go ahead and use the select method. And the select method allows me to pass in CSS selectors that then try and find a given HTML element. And in this case, I know that I was able to find there is a div with an ID of comic, but I don't want the whole div. What I want is the image inside of it. And so I can use just very simple CSS selector to say target all images inside of the comic div. And that is going to return a list of elements that matches that description. Now, for us, that list should only be one element long because there's only really one thing to match. Let's go ahead and see if that's true. I'm going to go ahead and print image elements. And let's go ahead and see what happens when I click run. Okay, I think I found it. You can see here we have an image, and really the most important thing here is that source, and that source seems to be taking us right here to that linear source.png. It's exactly what we want. The problem, though, it's not really a problem, but the problem is that this is technically inside of a list, which sort of complicates the object a little bit. So what I'm going to do is, because I know I only want to find that one object, I'm actually going to return only the first element of that list. And if I were to, and remember, in Python and all programming languages, we always start counting at 0, not 1. So if I were to just add this square bracket syntax here, you're going to notice that I can click run, and it is the same thing, except it's no longer in a list. It's now just the image itself, which is exactly what we want. The problem, though, is I don't really care about all of this, the HTML here. The thing I actually care most about is going to be this source attribute, because the source is actually where the image lives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now say image source. So I'm creating a new variable now. I've yanked out the whole the whole image tag, but I only care about one portion of it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull from the image element, and Beautiful Soup lets me actually request the value of variables really easy by just calling them in square brackets. So in this case, I want to extract the source, the value of the source, which should be the URL. Let's go ahead and see if that's true. So image source. I'm going to click run. And you're going to notice, awesome, what I have here beautifully is the actual URL. Now, it's actually not quite the full URL. An odd quirk about this, and you're going to encounter all types of quirks in web scraping, whether it's this or something else that's weird, is for whatever reason, they don't include the HTTP onto this, which I think is a little odd. And so before I actually print the image source, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say image source is going to be equal to HTTP : and you can see it already has the two slashes there, not colon, sorry, colon, and then the / will be completed. So I'm going to say image source. And what that should do is that it should add this. Now you're going to notice I have a red squiggly line under here, and that's because this, weirdly enough, is still being treated as a list a little oddly whenever I pull out any elements from this. And so there's kind of two ways I could do this. One is I could come over here and just yank out the first object, which is fine because the assumption is that there's always going to be multiple things that you're matching to. Very rarely are you really going to find just the one thing because websites are really big and complex. So notice I've just pulled out the first source out of this. Another option is that it didn't like that I was trying to basically match a list and a string. So I could also do a very rudimentary way to get around that by essentially just stringifying the value here, and then it will add them together. In either case, either is going to be just fine. I'm going to click run, and now you're going to notice that I have the full URL. And I like to do, whenever I'm web scraping like this, especially when I'm hunting for like a URL or a very specific value, is I can highlight this, copy it, and boom, that is going to take me exactly to what I want. So that is perfect. Okay, so now that I found the URL of the image, my second major part, if I can imagine that, part 3, is that I want to download the comic. And downloading the comic is shockingly easy. Now, there's a lot of libraries for this, and there's a lot of libraries that are basically just wrappers for the request library. And so since I don't want to import too many libraries, and I want to sort of show us different use cases of requests, we're going to go ahead and get this working. So essentially what I can do is, if you come back over to here, and if I were to look back at the inspect element tool, go back to network and refresh, you're going to notice that over here, they actually made a request for that webcomic, because when it got to the image, it said, yo, go load that image, and it makes another request. And as you can see here, they're just running a GET request to the location of the PNG, and the response is actually a PNG file. And we know it's a PNG file because it says PNG. I can also preview it, and you can see that's what it looks like when it's previewed. So I want to use the same request library to go grab it. However, because this is an image, we also have to effectively write that data to our drive. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and start by requesting that image. So I'm just going to reuse that response object, because essentially it's already served its purpose up above by parsing out our beautiful soup. So I'm going to ask for another response. And in this case, I'm going to pull from the request library, requests.get. And in this particular case, I want to go ahead and add in the image source. So I want to actually pull that image down. Now, if I were to try and print the content here, the response.content, you're going to notice that I'm going to get garbage. This is basically the hex code of my PNG, which is not really readable inside of my terminal here. Instead, what I want to do is I want to save it to my file or my local folders. Now, there's a number of ways to do this in Python, but the absolute simplest way is going to be the file with open, which, funny enough, I actually always forget how to do this, and I always end up having to like Google this. Even in real time, I'm going to have to do that. But that's okay. I like to model that no one can have all of the stuff in their head at all times. So that's just a simple Google search away. Download file using requests in Python. downloads a large file. It shouldn't be really any different. It's going to be with open using requests. And then, yes. Okay. So basically, this is going to be what we want to do. And I'm going to remove a lot of these comments. That's our school bell. That's fun. Okay. So essentially, what we're going to do is we want to use this with open syntax. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say with open, and I'm going to open up a file. Now, in this case, it's going to be a file that doesn't exist. So I'm going to go and call this comic.png because I know that it's a comic. And I like to actually say file because that's what F actually stands for. And then file, write whatever the response's content is. And this is going to essentially go get the actual file. But remember, a response object contains tons of data. It doesn't just contain the image. It contains all the headers and all the other information. So what I want is I just want the content, but I need to be able to write this to my local file system. And I can do that using the native with open function in Python. And just explaining this is targeting the actual name that I want to write it to. This is the write bytes. So I'm expecting bytes and I want to write those bytes to my computer as opposed to like reading them. And then as file. So that's like a temporary variable that I've created. And then that file, what do I want to do with it? Well, I want to write some data. What do I want to write? I want to write whatever was in that response's content. Now in Replit, you can actually see I have a little bit of a file system. I am going to delete that for right now. That was part of my testing. So notice I only have a main.py here, but if I click run, assuming I have no errors, you're going to see that I have comic.png. And if I click on that, Replit actually even has a cool photo previewer. VS Code should also have a previewer as well. So you should be able to see that this has successfully been downloaded. And that, quite frankly, is like almost the bulk of our problem solved. We've been able to go to a website, find the source, download the source, and really our next step is just do that 3,000 times, right? But if you know anything about programming, you know that code repetition and code repetition is basically just a loop, right? So we've actually done the bulk of the work here. I will say I do want to make one slight change to our code because as we start downloading these comics, we don't necessarily want to keep calling it comic.png because it's going to keep overwriting it. Now, I could do something really simple and just do 1, 2, 3, 4. That would actually be a pretty simple solution, but I actually like something a little bit better, and I want to actually get the name of the comic itself. So in order to get that, it's not hard, but what I want to do is come back up to my source here, and I want to see if I can actually get the actual name. So we know that the URL looks something a little bit like this. If I were to come back over to here, open in a new... open in a new tab. There we go. So we know that it's going to be like images.xkcd.com/comic/linear sort. And so what I want to do is find out how can I just get this chunk here. Thankfully, there's a built-in Python method that allows us to split a string by a given delimiter. And in this case, URLs are beautifully split using slashes. So I should be able to in some way grab that name. So let's come back over to our code. And back when I was actually grabbing my source, that actually seems thematically the right spot of when I'd want to grab this. So I'm going to find the get the name of the file. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say image name, and I'm going to set that equal to image. Well, actually, before I do that, let's actually just view the output of something real quick. So I'm going to print something, and I'm going to print image source split. And what split allows me to do is split a string using some type of special character. And in this case, I want to split the string every time it encounters a slash. So if I click run, you're going to notice that I return a list, and that list has HTTP / then another slash with nothing in it because it's // right? And then I have images.xkcd.com, awesome, /comics /linear sort. Now, because this website's really simple, I probably could just say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I could just invoke the fourth element of the array. However, in Python, there's actually a trick to always grab the last item because that really is going to be the name of our file. And what I want to actually do is just return -1. And what -1 does starts at 0, and -1 goes to the end of the list or the array. And so now I can always reliably pull the last element of a Python list using this kind of cool trick. So if I run this now, it should just return linear sort.png. And so now I have the name of my file. And instead of printing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it img name. And now I have that actual image name with its file extension, which is going to be helpful, saved as a variable. And the only change I'm going to make here now is if I scroll down to my with open, instead of just hard coding in a file name, I can now use this image underscore name as a way to dynamically grab that content. So instead of calling it just comic.png, if I run this again, you're going to notice that now it's going to be linear sort.png. And nowhere did I hard code that. It pulled that from the actual URL. Ooh, okay. We have accomplished the first major hurdle of web scraping, which is, do I even know how to target a page and extract data from it? And quite frankly, for some web scraping applications, you've actually solved your whole problem because maybe you have a giant web page that you want to parse and you don't need to systematically move page by page by page by page. So you actually have enough information here with Beautiful Soup to begin even understanding how to work with them. However, in our case, we want to also not only just yank something off of a single page, but we want to go page by page by page by page and extract every single web comic. So to do that, what we're going to do is think about in our head how we would need to update some of the code we have to be able to be conducive to that. And really, the only thing we have to modify is way, way, way up here with our URL. And so what I'm going to do is kind of above all of my code at the very beginning, I'm going to kind of create two different URLs. I'm going to go ahead and call what I call base URL. And base URL is going to be just the raw xkcd.com, which is going to be this guy right here. I'm going to set that equal. And then what I want to do is I want to actually take this URL object and the URL, the working URL that I want to work with is going to be the very first page. Now, one of the cool things about the XKCD website is that they have a pretty simple system of moving through their pages. So if I were to come over here, you can see that if I go to the very end, the very first webcomic is xkcd.com/1. And that if I were to go to the very, very beginning, or not beginning, but the very end, the most recent one, it's just the raw website. But if I were to try and click next, what you're going to notice is that it just keeps taking me to this one. And that actually the real homepage, instead of /number, is /#. And so I don't even have to know how many comics there are. Like I don't need a for loop, for instance. I can just say, keep going forward until you hit the £. And so that's a really nice way for us to be able to have a really clear stopping point where we're going to say, keep incrementing, keep incrementing, keep incrementing until you hit this. Okay, so with that being said, let's now come back over to our code to see how we can actually work with this. So I'm basically going to say while, and then in here, I'm going to say URL is not, or I should say, while a £, is not in URL. And this is why I love Python, by the way. It is so plain English, very clear. So as long as this URL here does not have a £, in it, I want to keep downloading and moving forward, downloading and moving forward, downloading and moving forward. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to essentially indent all of this code, and I'm going to include all of this inside of my while loop. So I'm going to do that one step at a time. I could copy it all. I did find that Python doesn't always necessarily like the tab key. They prefer spaces, which is fine. So I'm going to include all or indent all of this into the actual while loop itself. Now, if I did this, it's going to loop forever. So we actually want to be careful. It's going to be an infinite loop, and it's going to keep downloading over and over and over and over again, which we don't want to actually click run quite yet. What I need to do is I essentially need to figure out what my next URL is going to be. That's going to be the only real thing I need to modify, because if you can see here, I start with URL. I ask, go get that URL, supify it, find the image name, download that image. But the third kind of major part here is if I were to go part 4, is I need to find the next button, essentially. And this is going to be the critical part, because this is going to tell me what the next page I need to go to is. Now, to do that, it's good to go back over to the actual source code. And for this time, I actually like using the inspect element tool, because I really care about one single button, and it helps kind of finding it within the page. So I'm going to click this next button here. And I want to see, is this going to be a unique object? So I can see here that this is an anchor tag, has a attribute of rel next with an href of pound sign. Now, if I were to go back, for instance, you're going to notice that if it's not the most current one, it's going to give me just the number of the actual web comic that I want to find next, which in this case is 3026. Now, what I want to do is I want to say, hey, beautiful soup, can I find this exact anchor? Now, there's a couple of ways to find this. First of all, I'm looking for something that's going to uniquely distinguish this out of everything else. And I am seeing this rel being relative to being next. That is pretty unique. And I could try and search for that. So let me go ahead and see if that returns anything else, or if that does return the one object that I want. Notice there's no class here, there's no ID, but that seems pretty unique to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over to here, and I'm just going to go ahead and, well, I guess this could theoretically result in an infinite loop. That's fine for right now. I'm not terribly worried. So I'm going to go ahead and print. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to say soup, meaning I have another question about the HTML. I'm going to go ahead and select, again, using the CSS selector is going to be really helpful here. And what I want to do here is I want to actually specify something. So this is going to be my CSS selector. And what I'm going to do is I noticed that that was inside of a class called comic nav. So I'm going to say within comic nav, I want to try and find an anchor that specifically has a rel equals next. And I think that is how you do that in this particular case. Now, this is actually pretty cool CSS syntax. I like this particular syntax a lot, because it allows us to be able to find things by an attribute uniquely. Usually you're not coding this way in CSS, but in web scraping, you got to make do with whatever the website has. What doesn't it like about this? Does it not like my indentation with this? Let me see. Oop. There we go. Okay. No? Strange. Okay. Is that even going to want to run that? No, it's not. Okay. Give me just a second. Control X that. Let's see. This is what I get for doing some initial copying with this. Boop, boop, boop. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Same with this one. There we go. Okay. Doesn't like this. Interesting. All right. Well, that is going to be fine for now. See if I can work with that. There we go. Okay. So at this point, looks like we were not able to find this here. I think I might need to put this in quotes. Is that true? I think it's like this. Boop, boop. Okay, let's run that. There it is. Okay. So unfortunately, this is currently in our loop and we're looping forever and ever and ever. But what this did tell me for just a moment, I can see that it did find a access key, href2. Now that's perfect because if you come up here, the actual URL we're working with right now is 1, which means that it found the next button, which would go to webcomic 2. And if I were to do that, it should be 3 and then 4. So what I did find is that this select statement here did successfully find the anchor tag that contains this information here, this 2, basically. So what I'm going to do is instead of calling this the print statement, let's go and save this to a variable. And this variable is going to be called, sorry. So there we go. So I'm going to go and call this variable next anchor, essentially. So the next anchor button. But remember, this is currently being processed as a list. So I like to just grab the first element here. The second thing that I want to do is now I want to pull out the actual source, the href for this. So I'm going to say next href. And I'm going to set this equal to the next anchor. And I can specify the attribute that I want to pull from this, which is going to be the actual href attribute. And that should now technically pull out this /2/. But again, this usually returns a list. So I want to grab just the first value here. So let's go ahead and see if this will actually print just /2. It looks like my indentation is being a little obnoxious here. There we go. Inconsistent tabs. There we go. Okay. Okay, we'll try that. What does it not like? It's funny, I've actually been using Replit for a long time, and I have not actually had these strange inconsistent tab spacing issues from them. Okay. In any case, this is going to actually be the actual one. This should just be the /2. So what I'm going to actually do now is now that I have essentially the next href here, what I want to do is I want to, let me see actually if that will print. There we go. Okay, next href. Why is print inconsistent use of tabs and spaces? I think it should work. All right, well, I'm not going to make you watch me debug that. That sounds horrifying and ridiculous. But what we're going to do is we're going to set this equal to that. And now that we have the /2 there, what I want to do is I want to now append that to our next URL that we want to do. So in order to know what the next URL is, oh, and by the way, all of this should have probably been here. Of course, it didn't like that. There we go. There we go. So now what I want to do is I want to find that the new updated URL. So when the loop goes all the way back up and it reruns URL here, I want to go ahead and have that be whatever the base URL was. In this case, base URL was defined way at the beginning as just the base XKCD. And I'm actually going to remove this slash here because we saw that it's going to grab the 2 slashes. So I don't need it here. It's going to be the base URL plus whatever I got as the value of the next href element. And what this should now do is this should be able to then move on to the next comic. To see if this actually works, let's go ahead and print. See, print the URL. That way we can actually see it. Okay, that should be fine. Oh my goodness, what is going on with my indentations? Okay, there we go. Let's run that. Okay, there we go. What is not liking that on line 34? 34. Is there like a weird line spacing issue here? I think these are warnings. They're not actually errors. Inconsistent pyrite. Next, href, inconsistent. Why is URL? I'm very sorry that this is so frustrating. I might actually even hop on to a different IDE because this is so causing issues. Let's run. Okay. Real quick, I'm gonna actually do this in VS Code for just a moment. As you can see, I was working on it. Control A, Control C, or Control Save, I should say. We're going to save this onto my desktops. We're going to call this scraping.py. Not scraping. We'll call it web scraping.py -1. And then we'll come over to here. And what doesn't it like over here? Yeah, it's still causing some strangeness. Okay, there we go. So it looks like there were some invisible tabs that I was having that was causing inconsistencies, because Python is all about those invisible line characters. And that makes me actually wonder if I can copy that. Oh, I see a lot of stuff in the chat. People are telling me probably what I was doing wrong. That's delightful. Hold on one second. That's fine. Okay. So I should now be able to go to view. Oh, God, go. Let's see. Terminal, new terminal. Where did this go? I'm going to seed into my downloads. Go Pi, web scraping -1. And now it's starting with, oh, interesting. So it looks like it was able to grab xkcd.com/1 URL. And then if I scroll all the way down here, all of that should be there. I'm going to look at the comments to see. We can't see your terminal or VS Code. Oh, no. Agreed. I think the first error happens, not let it go in the next line. Do the same thing in the other ones. One more time, I think next x-ray. One more space needed before. Oh, it looks like it's only snagging just that one window. That's totally fine. I'll bring this back in. I think some folks, they get really freaked out when errors happen, but I also think that this is in a lot of ways really indicative of like real coding. So I think it's always can be helpful to show that not everything is always perfect as it is. So it looks like on line 34, it looks like the issue is here. So let's see if that's going to cause those. One more line. It should be on the same line as these, which is frustrating that it is not. Let's bring this all the way back here. I'm going to bring this to the exact line of width. Okay, I think this is solving the problem. I just needed to give it a little breathing room. Okay, great. And let's get rid of that extra space there. Okay, let's run this now. Okay, so something happened where now let's go ahead and take a look at printing this to see what's actually wrong. So it should just be printing. Oh, what didn't it like about that? Is invalid keyword argument. What? Okay, print. Oh, no, it should print next. Oh, because it's the actual assignment. There we go. Okay, let's print that. And so now it's just printing that one. That's interesting that it is not getting the actual href here. So that should be getting, if I were to select, what if I were to select one? Is there another one in that list? No. So let's take one step back then. Let's go ahead and print this and see what is coming out of when I select that anchor. I can see, stop, that I have /2. I wonder if it is not necessarily coming in as a list, is it? No, it is. And it is grabbing that first one. So let's come back over to here. Let's click run. Great. So that is my anchor tag. So from here, I want to print the, now this is no longer print. I'm going to call this next anchor tag is equal to, that's the whole anchor. And then I want to just pull out just the href here. Select. Oh, there it is. Yeah, because that was an extra one. Thank you. And yet it's just only pulling out the one. Let's just pull out the anchor, the href 2. Oh, okay. So apparently it wasn't coming in as a list. So there it is. So we didn't need to pull it in as a list from there. Now we're going to say that's the next URL is going to be the next href equals. It's going to be our base URL plus our next URL. And it doesn't like that. Oh, because we need to stringify it. Nice. All right. And we are officially back into business. And now what we can see is we are successfully moving forwards. We can now see that our URLs are going 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Out of all that goofiness with our indentations in Python, we now have the ability to grab all of those. Now we are basically nearly there. You can see that I actually already started downloading all of our webcomics, and technically we are done. However, they're all getting dumped inside of just our core directory, which I don't necessarily really like. So the one final change I'm going to make to this is when I'm actually going to save that using this write open, I'm going to literally just have a new folder, which I'm going to create now called folder. I'm going to go and call it comics. And instead of just writing into my local directory, I'm going to say comics / and then whatever the image name is. And what that should do is that should now save them into my comics folder. And if I click run, you're going to see, huzzah, we have this successfully going. I actually even like printing these URLs because we get some visual feedback that it's still working. You could do some kind of fun print statements and things like that to be able to say, now downloading this image. So there's other things you can do. I'm going to press stop here because I personally don't need all 3,000 of these. But of course, you could let this run and you can have a really fun collection of webcomics. But more than anything, I just kind of wanted to share that this is sort of the a multi-step process. And if I could just take like 30 seconds to review what my code is doing. Essentially, we need requests in Beautiful Soup. Request lets us request web elements. Beautiful Soup lets us be able to traverse those web elements. I had to begin by requesting and soupifying our object. And once it's soupified, the sky is the limit. But in our case, we wanted to find the unique URL of that particular webcomic. And so we did that by finding the image, yanking out the attributes. And this is kind of a quirk of web scraping, but sometimes that data isn't always in a perfect format. So I actually had to modify it a little bit. I even got creative in being able to extract the name of the file by using some native Python methods like split. Then once I have just the URL, I'm able to invoke web request again to now download web assets using a relatively simple response get and then write it out. And then part 3, I'm a little terrified to do this because I think our comment was causing issues with our spacing. But our final part is that if I need to continue to move forward, going by page by page by page, I have to find some mechanism that essentially lets me click the next button. And in this case, clicking the next button is more finding where the next button takes me and then reload the page based off of where it needs to go. Now, you should include an exit condition, but sometimes web scraping is enough where you just let it run until it errors because that's how it determines that there was an end. And then you've already collected all of the data that you need. So web scraping is a very imperfect science. It can be brittle. Like the moment the website changes any of those class names or those ID names, then it can cause our script to break. But in any case, This, I think, is kind of like the end of the workshop. And what I am going to do is I am going to actually copy this code and I'm going to go ahead and share it with you as well. I actually think I might be able to inside of Replit right here. How about I download this Python file, and then I'm going to come back over to the chats and I'm going to go ahead and upload this right now. Let's see, file from my computer, downloads, and main.py. Okay, so in the chat, in case you were, oh, I just sent it to one random person. That's delightful. Let's do it one more time, except this time I will share it with the rest of the group. Amazing. So you should be able to see now that the main.py file is in the chat. So if you're at all interested in being able to follow along with the code, repurpose it, maybe you see what my goofy error was, but that effectively is going to be the end of today's workshop that has us working through it. I want to reemphasize that the links, I'll actually post them again right now. I'll post those in the chat. These are going to be some of the links to those Google Docs that I was talking about that sort of tell you how to get started with Beautiful Soup. And then the really cool thing, this is just a plug for Codecademy, is that they actually have a whole Beautiful Soup learning module. So if you're interested in this, this is also something you can continue to extend your knowledge of as well. You aren't going to get very far if you don't know a little bit about HTML, you don't know a little about CSS, and you don't know a little bit about HTTP. Awesome. I wanted to go ahead and I guess open it up. Stephanie, I don't mind sticking around for another 10 or 15 minutes if folks do have any questions. Obviously, if you are having like code issues, it's gonna be a little tough for me to answer. But if you have any like more abstract questions about Beautiful Soup, or if you have any more general questions about web scraping, now would be the time to ask.
Thanks, Tobin. We're going to stay on for about 10 more minutes. So if you have any questions, now is your time to ask. Tobin, you can just keep an eye on the chat. I'm sure people will just probably
Sure.
that. And you can answer them as you go. Just a reminder, we're going to have this recording on the event page comments, and then we're also going to probably have it on Codecademy's official YouTube. So you can keep an eye out on both places to review all this really great information. But Tobin, I think there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, the question around legal and ethical implications. Essentially, web scraping is kind of a bit of a gray area. Obviously, if you're scraping data you already own or it's a public access information, it's generally speaking going to be okay. There are a couple of things we got to be mindful of. First of all, if you have an account with that given website and their terms of service say you can't scrape our data, then that's going to be against their terms of service, and then they would have at least the right to like terminate your account, for instance. The second thing is that a lot of websites have something called a robots.txt, and I'll actually see if I can use codecademy.com. Let's see if they have one. Robots.txt. Yep. So you can see here that in a lot of websites, they actually have a way for you to be able to say, hey, if you're scraping me, you're not allowed to go to those places. And so this is actually something where if you are doing any kind of web scraping, you need to be mindful that if they are explicitly telling you to not go to these places, that you really shouldn't be, because for whatever reason, the website either says it could pose a security risk or it might impact their infrastructure. The other thing we have to be mindful of as well is that when you are hammering a website with tons and tons and tons of resources, you could inadvertently hit them with a denial of service. So obviously, if a website can't handle, one request every second, it's a pretty brittle website, but nonetheless, you have to be mindful of that. But it is certainly a legal gray area. And I will tell you, a lot of websites don't like you scraping their website, but it is also public information, and you are just accessing their site. And so it really is going to be on a case-by-case basis. And I would just say the general rule of thumb is do no harm. Always ask for permission if you are unsure. And obviously, web scraping has a big competitive advantage where scrape data and put it on your website immediately. It just kind of can feel a little scummy at times if what you're using web scraping for feels scummy. But, for me, when I've encountered it, it's just been an interface with big data sets that I just have to save time working on, for instance, which for me, that's automating the boring stuff, right? That's the part of the job that I think can be really fun. So that's a great question. I hope I answered it. But the most simple version of it's a gray area and be kind when you're doing it. Is Replit IDE solely ID web based? Yes, that is a feature of it, but also can be a bug in the sense of that you don't have some of the same control. They're also pushing a lot of their AI into it as well to have like an integrated chat GPT esque thing. I think it's a pretty cool platform. I use it a lot with my students because I don't like playing tech support with them. It just kind of works. But certainly, if you have an IDE and an environment you like working in, I'm not saying it's going to be the best one. It tends to work, or at least I thought it would work pretty well for a workshop like this. Yeah. Two questions. How do you ensure a website allows web scraping? Robots.txt is a way they can really explicitly say. And then the terms of service as well is a way that you can see whether or not they allow or don't allow it. How do you ensure you're not going to crash a website or get captured? You can't. I mean, quite frankly, if you're going to hammer a website with a ton of traffic, then it is going to always be a risk. Like I said, if a website is so brittle that it can't handle one request every second, it's going to be a pretty brittle website. That is to say, generally speaking, more robust websites that seem to be running modern infrastructure, you're going to be fine. CAPTCHA, you don't always know. There are systems in place that you can prevent and detect web scraping, and they might just auto ban your IP. So just keep that in mind that you might all of a sudden be working on your web app. You've run your 20th or 30th or 50th sort of test, and all of a sudden, boom, you're kicked out and it's not working. That could be because they blocked your IP address. So keep in mind that depending on the sophistication of the app, you may or may not be able to get access to it. It is possible to prevent web scraping. There's a lot of really interesting approaches. There's a lot of time-based ones. One of my favorite ones, because I teach cybersecurity, is that if you are accessing, like if you, for instance, a way to detect whether or not you are not obeying robots is that if you scrape, like you can set up a trap in your robots.txt that says disallow secret dot html or disallow super secret login. And if anything ever visits that page, you can auto ban their IP address. And that's a way to sometimes detect web scrapers that are not actually adhering to the robots.txt. And then as a result, it then can kind of mitigate it. So that's one of my favorite ones. Why did I use HTTP? Let me take a look over here. Are they using HTTPS? I don't know. Oh, it is secure. That's a good question. I think probably just because I'm used to writing HTTP when I'm doing like cybersecurity capture the flags, I probably should have been using HTTPS. It should work both ways. That was just a quirk on my end. You should probably be able to use both. I worked a lot with pictures. I'm guessing you can also download videos too. Yes, you can download videos, especially if you just get access to the MP4. Right now, I don't think I have an immediate answer to being able to limit the amount of bytes you can download. I'm sure there's Python libraries that let you monitor that, especially if you're worried about your own like traffic. You could also throttle it manually. You could say, download a video, wait a minute, download the other video, wait a minute. And that could potentially be a way to manually throttle your own access to it if you're trying to download like maybe something bulk from some repository somewhere. Yeah. How is web scraping different to mobile or desktop app scraping? Is it even possible? Well, the thing about web scraping, or I should say about Beautiful Soup, is that Beautiful Soup parses HTML. So if you are trying to access a web application that you can use getting with the response library, then technically it is scrapable. But the concept of scraping in general is more agnostic. If you are able to make a request for any information, get that information, look through it, and extract information, that is scraping in a nutshell. It's just web scraping is such a mature field and has such robust tools that the Python request library to get and Beautiful Soup to be able to extract information is such an effective way to do that Not all other platforms have that exact same framework. So some mobile and desktop apps like Electron apps or mobile apps, they do use HTML, CSS. But what you'd have to do is figure out what is that platform using? How do you request information? How do you parse that information? And then the same steps are functionally the same. I don't know if hopefully that answered your question. I don't want to download 250 gigabytes all at once. Fair enough. That is byte limiting. Another one as well, like I said, byte limiting could also be wait until download is finished. So you can literally have like a pause function. Yes, that's absolutely true. I have definitely in some of the apps that I've done where I've built some proof of concept scripts for like cybersecurity, I have intentionally put in waiting periods to allow the server to process information before I move on. So it reduces how fast my app can work, but that's okay because then I let it run and then I go get lunch and then I come back and it's done, right? So that can certainly be helpful. Yes, turning on a timer there is a basically like I forget, all languages are a little different. Python's going to have some sleep or delay function that you certainly could do, and then you can let it run for a week if you really wanted to kind of go under the radar. Absolutely. Um, okay, I think that's it, Stephanie. You said that was one last question, and then I asked a whole bunch of questions. So,
No,
uh,
it's okay. Maybe we can take one more from Nelson. You want to answer that one, and then we'll wrap up after that question.
yeah, sure. When working with clients, for example, to take data to perform A/B testing, should we usually do web scraping or should the client deliver us access to the data? Great question. I mean, I would say generally speaking, whenever you're working with a client, you should always ask for that data. It's always going to be probably sanitized. It's going to be the data that they want. But let's be real. We work on the real world with clients that don't always know what they're asking for or don't always know how to give us the information we need. So if you get authorization that web scraping could be an option, or they give you some impossible task with no data and they say the deadline is tomorrow, this could be an option. But I would say definitely if you're working with client data, your probably first effort should be to ask them for the data, unless the scope is pull it from our website, right? So yeah, that's a great question. It just kind of depends. Yeah, good question. Stephanie, I think that's pretty much everything.
Yes. Tobin, thank you so much. Thank you so much for just walking through this workshop with us and just making it so fun and energetic.
Sure.
Everyone here in this community and in this room right now, thank you for being here. We hope to see you again in the new year with all the events that we have coming up. Again, this event will be posted on YouTube for our Codecademy's YouTube page, as well as the event comments. And if you have any questions, you can let us know in the event chat. And then, Tobin, if you want to link your LinkedIn real fast in the comments,
Sure.
Tobin
Yeah.
has graciously if you mentioned that if you want to reach out to him or connect with him, he is going to link his LinkedIn in the chat and you can connect with him there.
Yeah, by all means. Yeah, I would love to. Feel free.
Awesome. I am going to be on for about 1 more minute to make sure everyone saves the links that they need to save. All the amazing content that Tobin has put together, please save those links as well as his LinkedIn. And then in about 1 minute, I'll close the room. But thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year.
Awesome. Hey, Stephanie, if I were to share those links with you, is it possible to put those on the description of the YouTube video,
Yes.
or is that like too
No, no,
much?
no. I can definitely do that. That's a great idea. And then I will
Okay.
also put those links in the event invite.
Awesome. Okay. I'll just email those to you so that way you'll
Great.
have those.
Cool. Thank
Okay.
you.
Stephanie, do you want me to stick around at all, or am I good to
No,
go?
feel free to hop off. Thank you so much for spending extra time with us. And everyone else, those links now, I guess, will be on the event page and the Codecademy YouTube, so we don't have to wait around. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, night, morning. See you all soon. Bye.